Welcome to the Paper Crafters Library. In part 2 of our Basics of Heat Embossing video, I'm going to show you how to actually heat emboss, as well as share with you some tips to get the best results. Now, if you're fairly new to heat embossing, then I encourage you to watch part 1 of our Basics of Heat Embossing video, because in that video I share with you what heat embossing is, what kinds of things it's used for, what you can heat emboss on, and then I cover the basic supplies of heat embossing. So this video is based on the assumption that you're already familiar with all of those things. I'm just going to show you how the process is actually done. So let's get started. So the first thing you need to do for heat embossing is to prepare your surface. You want to make sure that your hands are clean and dry, and that whatever surface you're planning on using is clean and dry as well. Otherwise, you'll end up with embossing powder sticking to any moisture that's on your surface. Now, a good example of this is this art journal page. The background of the art journal page was created using a variety of different wet mediums, including some distress stains, acrylic paints, and mists. Now, had I done my stamping and heat embossing of my images while my background was still damp, instead of these nice, clearly defined images, I would have ended up with flecks or patches of embossing powder all over my surface. So when you're working on just, let's say, a plain surface that has nothing on it, the only moisture you really have to worry about is if there's anything in your hands. But when you have already treated your surface or used different mediums on your surface, at that point it's especially critical to make sure your surface is dry. And all that means is take a heat tool and use the heat of the heat tool to thoroughly dry your surface before you proceed with your heat embossing. So regardless of what surface I'm using, whether it's paper or another material, I like to prepare my surface by running an anti-static bag over it. And this is what an anti-static bag looks like. It's a little fabric bag that contains a powder. Now this powder is designed to minimize static, but also help absorb any bits of moisture on your surface. So to use it, you simply hold it and run it over the surface onto which you're planning on heat embossing. And this is going to minimize the chance of embossing powder sticking to areas where you don't want it. Now, as long as your hands are dry, your surface is dry, using an anti-static bag may not be necessary depending on the brand of embossing powder you're using, as well as the surface you're working on. Now, our personal favorite brand of embossing powder here at Paper Crafters Library are the WOW embossing powders. Not only because they're great quality and they have a huge selection, but because WOW embossing powders run their powders through a special process to make them anti-static. So when we're working on a matte finished paper or cardstock, we found that unlike other brands of embossing powders, we don't need to use an anti-static bag with our WOW embossing powders. Now, if you are working on glass, acetate, metal, or other non-porous surfaces, then even with our WOW embossing powders, and especially with any other type of embossing powder, we always like to run an anti-static bag over it. And I'm just going to show you a couple of examples. So here I have some acetate, and I'm just going to hold this piece of cardstock behind it. Here you can see around my image all these flecks of my embossing powder. And I did not pre-treat this piece of acetate with my anti-static bag. Now, if you take a look at that same stamped image on the same type of acetate, which had my anti-static bag run over the surface, you can see here that it's a nice clean image and there's virtually no specks of embossing powder in undesirable areas. And I'm just going to show you one more example with metal, which is also a non-porous surface. I don't know how well the camera picks this up, but all around the image you can see that there's tons of little flecks of embossing powder. But here on this metal piece where we ran the anti-static bag over it, there's virtually none. So it does make a really big difference in the finished outcome of your embossing to use the anti-static bag on a non-porous surface. So let's get into the embossing itself. So there are three main ways that you can heat emboss. The first way is using stamps in a slow drying medium. Now, which medium and which embossing powder you choose depends on the effect that you're going for. Here I'm going to be using this Wow Embossing Powder Primary Apple Red Regular Embossing Powder. Because this is a colored embossing powder, I'm not going to see the ink that I have underneath. So in that case, Versamark ink is fine. This is clear, colorless, it's slow drying, it's sticky, so the embossing powder is going to stick to this fine. Now, if the only powder that you have is a clear embossing powder, then the color is going to come through from whatever surface or medium you have underneath. So if you're working on a light colored cardstock and you want a colored image, in that case the color would come from something like a pigment ink or even from an acrylic paint. So when you're ready to stamp, I've already gone ahead and run my anti-static bag over it. Here I'm working just on a white piece of cardstock. I'm going to take my Versamark pad and I'm going to pat it all over the surface of my stamp. Make sure that it's well inked. I'm then going to take my stamp and I'm going to stamp it onto my cardstock, pressing straight down, lifting straight up. I'm then going to take my image and I'm going to take my embossing powder and sprinkle it over the entire surface of the image. And you want to make sure that the entire image is completely covered. Then you just take your surface and you tilt it slightly and very carefully tap off the excess embossing powder. And after you've tapped off whatever you can, I like to flip my piece over and just give it a few flicks on the back. So if my surface is a flexible surface, then I flick it as you've just seen me do. If it's a more rigid surface, then I just tap it gently with the side of my hand to remove any excess embossing powder. Now this is where coffee filters come in. In part 1 of our Basics of Heat Embossing video, I talked about coffee filters as an optional supply, but one that I generally use and keep on hand all the time. And that's because it's very easy to funnel the excess powder back into your container. I just fold my coffee filter in half, and then here where the little scalloped edges are, the ruffles, whatever you want to call it, I pinch close to that, and then I hold it over my container, gently tap the back of my coffee filter to funnel all of that back into my container. And what I like about the coffee filter, as you can see here, is you end up with almost nothing left over, so you get no wastage of your embossing powder. Now, if you don't have coffee filters, you can simply fold up a piece of copy paper, fold it in half, open it up, work over your copy paper, and then when you're finished, you simply tilt the sides upwards to funnel the embossing powder to the center crease, and then you would very carefully hold it. Again, I like to pinch it just above the crease and tilt and tip it into my container. Now I just want to take a minute to talk about storing your embossing powder in plastic containers. This is a common practice and one that I did myself for years until a recent conversation with one of the owners of Wow Embossing Powders. I learned that this is a big no-no. As I mentioned a few moments ago, Wow embossing powders are specially treated so that they're anti-static. When you store your Wow embossing powders in untreated plastic containers, all the work that they do to remove the static essentially flies out the window. So the best thing you can do is to keep your embossing powders in their original containers. So the last tool that I wanted to mention is this tray you see here, sometimes referred to as a tidy tray, a funnel tray, or a powder pal. It's a plastic tray that has sides and it has a funnel at one end. People often use this in the same way I showed you how I use a coffee filter or copy paper, and then any excess embossing powder they funnel through this little hole at the end back into their container. Well, I recently learned, again in my conversation with one of the owners of Wow Embossing Powders, is that this is actually the absolute worst way that you can work with your embossing powders, because it actually increases the amount of static in your embossing powders without giving the electrical buildup time to leak away. So our recommendation is to work over coffee filters like you saw us do a few moments ago, as they're easy to find, they're very economical, and they'll help you maintain the anti-static properties of your Wow embossing powders. So once I've tapped off as much powder as I can, my next step is to take a look at the image to see if there are any stray flecks of embossing powder. That's where my paintbrushes and my craft knife come in. If I see embossing powder around the perimeter of my image, that's where I'll take my larger paintbrush to just very quickly and easily brush that away. If there are any embossing powder flecks in the inner portion of the image, that's where I take my small paintbrush to clean that off. Then if there's anything that's very close to the image, or I'm not sure if my little paintbrush will get in there, that's where I take my craft knife and use the tip to very carefully pick up those flecks of embossing powder. And then at that point, once I've removed all the embossing powder, my image is now ready to heat so that I can melt and fuse my embossing powder. So once I'm ready to melt and fuse my embossing powder, the first thing I do is make sure that I'm on a good heat-resistant surface. So here I'm working on my Ranger nonstick craft mat. I mentioned this in part 1 of our Basics of Heat Embossing video. This withstands temperatures, I believe it's up to 800 degrees Fahrenheit, and my heat tool certainly is going to get probably close to 400 degrees, and embossing powder itself melts between 275 to 300 degrees Fahrenheit. So you want to make sure that you protect the tabletop that you're working on. If you don't have a non-stick craft pad, then a nice thick stack of papers, or working on a piece of wood, anything that gives thickness and is okay to withstand heat to protect your tabletop. Now my heat tool of choice is the Ranger Heated Craft Tool, and primarily it's because of how quiet it is in relation to pretty much all the other heat tools in the market. Now when embossing, I hold my heat tool probably about 2 to 3 inches above my image. Initially, I'll start by focusing the airstream in one section, and then as my embossing powder starts to melt, I'll move my heat tool. Now some people like to heat the underside of the surface. So they hold their heat tool like this, and then they hold their image on top like that. That's not my favorite way because, one, I can't hold it in my fingers because the heat gets really hot on my fingers, so you have to hold it with something that can withstand heat and not burn your fingers. But honestly, I have not found any difference in the quality of my finished product whether I emboss from the underside or from the top. So I think that's personal preference, and my preference is to heat from the top. So I'm holding my heat tool in one spot to start with. It's probably about 2 inches away from my surface, and I'm looking at my embossing powder to start paying attention to when my change comes, when it starts melting. And you see that happen usually within a few seconds. Initially it looks like nothing's happening, and then you're going to see your embossing powder start to melt. Well, in most embossing powders. Some embossing powders you're not going to notice the difference, especially the more matte embossing powders. But as you can see, as I'm holding my heat tool over my paper, the embossing powder is melting and it's becoming shiny, the color's becoming more intense. At this point, I'm just moving my heat tool to make sure that the entire stamped image that has embossing powder is completely melted. And when you see that the entire area, in this case with this embossing powder, it's raised and it's shiny and it's smooth, then you can turn your heat tool off. With other embossing powders where the change is not so obvious, you're just going to kind of need to pay attention, watch it to see, look a little bit more closely to pay attention to when it's completely melted. Now, you don't want to immediately stick your fingers on the embossing powder. The temptation when you see this beautiful raised shiny surface is to run your fingers over it. It's critical that you let this dry or you let this set for a few minutes for the embossing powder to cool. Embossing powder, as I mentioned, it melts at temperatures of 275 to 300 degrees Fahrenheit, and it's hot enough to burn you quite badly if you get this molten embossing powder on your skin. Now you also have to be aware of what surface you're working on. If you're working on metal, you're working on glass, those take a lot longer to cool down, so you want to leave those for a bit longer before you go ahead and touch it. So now the second way you can emboss is through a template. So here I'm taking one of my Crafter's Workshop templates, I'm laying it over my surface, and then I'm going to take my Versamark pad, same pad I just used for my stamped images. I'm making sure my template is being held in place, and then I'm just pressing my Versamark pad against the template and pressing it down through the paper below. So then here you can see, if I take my embossing powder and I sprinkle it on, you can see what a really cool pattern I get, and that's just with the template. The advantage of the template is that it's a lot cheaper than stamps. So if you want to start by getting some really neat patterned effects on your paper, even if you create your own stencils, you don't want to invest in stamps yet because you don't own any, this is a really good option. And then you just emboss the same way that I showed you with my stamped image. So the final main way that you can emboss is simply by taking your medium, patting it all over your surface. So here I've got a piece of plain chipboard in the scalloped flower shape, and I've stuck it to my scrap paper using a temporary adhesive. And then you simply hold it over your filter or whatever you've chosen, sprinkle on your embossing powder, tap off the excess. Now here you will notice embossing powder around your image. That's where I got my Versamark pad. When I pressed down on the image, it got on my cardstock as well. So there is a little bit of wastage doing it this way, but not too bad. And then you simply heat it the exact same way that I did for the other two, or for the stamped image that I showed you earlier. Now when you're patting your Versamark pad all over a surface, really what you can do with that is absolutely unlimited. You can cover chipboard shapes like this. You can use it for techniques like this one here. At the edge of my art journal page, I simply ran my medium over it. Or actually, no, I think I used my Versamark pad. I just kind of pressed that against the edge of my page, and I used a really neat verdigris blended embossing powder on that. Or you can even cover the entire surface of a chipboard album if you want to, or a wood block or a wood frame. So there's a huge amount of things you can do simply with your Versamark pad and your embossing powder by covering an entire surface. So that gives you an overview of the three main ways to heat emboss. For additional videos on embossing and embossing techniques, be sure to visit the Paper Crafters Library website. Now, if you're watching this video from somewhere other than Paper Crafters Library, in the video description section you'll find a link to our website. Just click on that link and it'll take you to the page that you see here. Where you see the red arrow, that's a video library link at the top of that page. Click on that to get to our public video library. Once you get to our online public video library, which you see here, scroll down this page until you get to our technique section. Our technique section is divided into categories and it's alphabetical, so scroll down until you see the heat embossing category denoted by the red arrow that you see here. Within that category you'll find all the videos that are in Paper Crafters Library on the topic of heat embossing. Well, I hope you found today's video informative, and we'll be back with more videos on heat embossing.